But the people in power are crooks. They're criminals, and they don't care. And they just will do whatever they can to plunder the American people as long as they can get away with it. That's fact number one. The Supreme Court will not touch this issue. This issue has never been brought to the Supreme Court. If it were to be brought to there today, those guys there sitting on the bench would say, we're not going to touch this thing. That potato is too hot. They're just going to turn their back on the Constitution.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. With us is a returning guest, G. Edward Griffin, renowned expert on the Federal Reserve and author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. He's a founder of Freedom Force International and RealityZone.com. Welcome back to Reluctant Preppers, Mr. Griffin.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Today I was hoping we could dwell on topics about the Federal Reserve and its constitutionality, its legitimacy, and then what we can do about it, and what would life be like if it were to be abolished for the average American, our relationship to it as a nation, as a people. And at the end of the time together today, I'd like to pick your brain just a little bit on your perspective on how does prepping or preparedness and resilience strengthen communities and families. So, first of all, basic question. In your view, is the Federal Reserve constitutional?
Well, I'll start with the short answer and then hopefully follow up with not a little longer one, not too long. Shorter answer is no. And the reason for that is that the Constitution is very specific in what it authorizes the federal government to do, and it authorizes the federal government to issue money, of course. Well, if the Federal Reserve is considered as the issuer of money, you might say that is constitutional. So what's wrong with that? Well, because the rest of that authorization was not just any old kind of money that you feel like issuing. The Constitution is very specific, and it says, well, the kind of money that is authorized is, and they use the word coin. It's, in other words, metal. It's precious metals. That's the kind of money that's in the Constitution. It says this is what shall be issued, and goes even further and says what shall not be issued. And it says what shall not be issued will be bills of credit, which means IOUs, which is what paper money is all about today. So the Federal Reserve, since it was created by Congress in 1913, has been the issuer of money. Well, Congress had that authority to grant to the Federal Reserve if it chose to do so, which I guess was a stupid move. But anyway, they had the authority to do it because they had the authority. But they did not have the authority to issue to the Federal Reserve powers which Congress itself did not have. Congress itself did not have the authority to issue paper money without being backed by precious metals. So therefore, it could not delegate that authority to the Federal Reserve, and so that's where the big problem comes in. The Federal Reserve has taken over the role of government in the issuance of our money system, and but it's doing so in a very unconstitutional manner.
Just to clarify one thing for myself and for our listeners, when we talked about the Coinage Act, or the clause of the Constitution that says Congress can create money through coins, for people who might object that, well, that was a quaint notion back in the time of our initial colonies, but now in the modern era we need larger amounts, then it's practical to deal with coins, and certainly we have electronic banking or something. But even when I was a kid, there were silver certificate dollar bills that said it's redeemable to payable to the bearer on demand in silver coin and that sort of thing. So whether it's paper notes or whether it was even electronic equivalent, that was, the understanding was, it was a claim receipt for precious metals. That's not to say that you had to do everything with physical coins, right? That it would still could be legitimate, but that's far from what our current currency is.
Well, right, yeah. Just because you the Constitution requires you to issue money that is coinage, and that's the fact of the matter, doesn't mean that you have to deliver the coins. I mean, you could issue a contract. You could say, I promise to deliver you these coins, and if you think I'm an honorable person and you are willing to take my promise on this written piece of paper, then that'll work fine. But if you don't think I'm an honest person, or you think I may be unable to deliver even though I want to, then you have the right to say, no, I want the coins, So that it's an issue of being able to sublimate your contract or not is a secondary issue. But the person that says, well, that's a quaint idea, that might have been necessary back in the days before we had computers and digital capacity and all that stuff. Sure, they could say that, and they do, but it'd be less like you and I. We sign a contract. Let's say I'm going to lend you $10,000, and you're going to take on a project. Let's say you're going to build something, and then it comes time to repay, and I say, okay, I want my $10,000 back, and you see it's here in the agreement, and you say, oh, that was a quaint idea back in those days when you lent me the money, but it doesn't count today. An agreement is an agreement, and if people really think that gold and silver is a quaint way of basing money, they're entitled to their opinion, but if we're going to change the agreement, let's change the agreement officially. Let's amend the Constitution to do so. Say, okay, we agree it's a quaint concept. We agree now it can be changed, but you can't just say, well, it was a quaint concept, and just say, because I think it was quaint, we don't have to honor these old rules and regulations anymore, if you follow what I mean.
And related, what about interest being due on our currency? Is that, in your view, is that correct, that we actually as a people are since the Federal Reserve was formed, have been subject to interest being due on our currency itself?
Well, that's unconstitutional, because the Constitution, as I mentioned before, prohibits issues of bills of credit. Well, bills of credit are IOUs. Those are promises to pay, and in other words, loans, and it's only those kinds of things that accrue interest. So if loans are prohibited, or borrowing is prohibited as a basis for money, then so is interest on those loans. You see, it's all part of the same package.
So if the Fed is unconstitutional, then how is it that we're stuck with it, and it's been lasting for 100 years?
Well, the answer to that is very simple, and it's very blunt, and people don't like to hear it spoken so bluntly. The fact is, two facts. First is that the people in power are crooks. They're criminals, and they don't care. And they just will do whatever they can to plunder the American people as long as they can get away with it. That's fact number one. The Supreme Court will not touch this issue. This issue has never been brought to the Supreme Court. If it were to be brought there today, those guys there sitting on the bench would say, we're not going to touch this thing. That potato is too hot. They're just going to turn their back on the Constitution. And so they're not good people. That's fact number two. And the other fact, which is equally disturbing, I think, is that the American people don't give a damn either. They're oblivious to this thing. They're not interested in learning, or if they do know about it, they say, well, that's for somebody else to worry about, or they're saying, well, let's not rock the boat. We don't want to, become controversial. In other words, it's complacency and criminality. That's the answer to the question.
So given that, do you believe that it's realistically possible to end the Fed?
It is realistically possible, in my view, but not under the present conditions. The present conditions are what I just described, unfortunately. But the hidden factor there is that there is a growing groundswell of awareness and opposition, awakening, indignation, moral indignation, righteous indignation on the part of the American people. Given that trend, and if it's allowed to continue, then we'll soon come to the place where we could change the political climate, and we could replace those people who are in positions of high power today, replace them with individuals who have no axe to grind except honesty and freedom and their country. And they're not trying to make a killing. They're not part of the good old boys club. They're not part of the elite or anything like that. If this trend is allowed to continue, we could very well find ourselves in a position within the next generation, probably the next generation, where, yes, it is very realistic to change all of this.
Do you have some specific ideas or visions of how that could be accomplished? Before you could get to that point, you'd expect to see certain bridges being crossed, or certain things being accomplished?
Well, yes, I have very, very clear visualization in my mind of how this can be brought about. In fact, it was that visualization that led me back in, I guess it was 2012, to create an organization to fulfill that visualization. The organization is called Freedom Force International. And the whole purpose of this movement and its building now is to bring this about. Well, what is this thing? How are we going to do that? Well, the first thing, of course, is to bring about a political change. We have to change the actual nameplates that are sitting on the desks and on the doors of those plush offices in Washington, D.C., and in a lot of the state capitals, and even on down to the county officials and so forth. The whole political system is populated today with people who have an agenda, and that agenda primarily is very personal. It's how to aggrandize themselves, get themselves power and money, influence. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but unfortunately, even though a lot of them talk very patriotically and they know how to pronounce the word Constitution and they know how to say rule of law, and they're kind of like, machines that say all the right phrases. But when you look at their political careers, they're literally, they're funded by some of the largest corporations and criminal syndicates, and they really don't have the best interests of the American people at all. And those people have to be removed from office and replaced by those who are, let's say, real Americans, and they're there to serve their country and not themselves. Okay, that's easy to say. How do you remove these people and replace them with better people? How do we even know, for example, who the better people are? Because anybody can give a good speech. Anybody can point with alarm to all the corruption that's going on in political office today and say, that's terrible, look at that crook. And what we don't realize is that the guy pointing the finger and speaking out against the crook is just as big a crook as the one he's complaining about. And he thinks that, and he's probably right, if we just put him in office, he can now take over that plush position. So we have to be very careful in knowing how to put new people in who actually are pure of heart. We have to have some standard by which we can measure that. We have to know what we believe in other words. We can't just say, well, these guys are crooks or they're tyrants, and we don't like this guy, we don't like that political party. We don't care anybody be better than that, so we go from one party to the next, one politician to the next, and maybe your listeners have noticed this has been going on for decades, and we just get rid of one bad group and replace him with another one. And the primary reason is that we don't ask the question, what is it that we want? What are our principles? What are the guidelines that we insist that these political officials must follow? We don't pay any attention to that. We're all focused on personalities and party labels and that kind of thing. When's the last time you heard anybody talk about real political principles in any major debate? It's all about, well, what are you going to do about this legislation? Or should we invade? Or should we pull our troops home? Or, some issue. Should this exemption be removed from our tax code? All these little specific issues. But do you ever hear anybody talk about principles? Well, I'm a little bit off the track. So when we formed Freedom Force International, one of the things we had to do is set forth a statement of principles that we all believe in. And that, therefore, when we put new candidates into office, they have been vetted because they stand for those principles. And they have said so, and they've demonstrated that they have. And we have some way to measure their performance against that statement of principles. We call it the Creed of Freedom. So that's the first thing that is necessary, is to know what we believe in. The old saying, if you don't believe in something, you'll fall for anything. And that's pretty much what the American people have been going through lately. They want freedom, but you ask the average person, how do you define freedom? And there's usually a moment of silence where they think about it. And the truth is, a lot of people just think that freedom is not being in jail. Well, if that's your definition of freedom, then that's, we're through. This nation is dead if that's all it is. So anyway, that's the first thing, is to have something, a statement of what we believe in. And then the next thing is to have a strategy to put people with those kinds of principles into office. How do you do that? Is it just sign up for the Republican Party or the Democrat Party or the Libertarian Party? Pick the party of your choice? Nope, that's not it. You've got to, this thing has to be more fundamental than political parties. You have to know how to generate popular support for a movement like this. And that means going into the power centers of society. What is a power center? Well, political parties are just one category of a power center. It could be labor unions, could be church organizations, civic organizations, professional groups, media centers, educational centers, universities, think tanks, nonprofit organizations, newspapers, radio stations, television stations, all of these groups and organizations which have influence over public opinion. Those are the power centers of America and any country. And the reason we're having this problem today is because almost without exception, every single important power center in society is now dominated by collectivists, people who like what's happening today. They like it very much, thank you. In fact, they're in the forefront of it. They are the ones who are making it happen. And therefore, they're able to lead public opinion through these power centers. Until we recognize that problem and replace those people, then the candidates that we're all focused on are never going to get elected. So in other words, it's a bigger project than just answering the question, who you're going to vote for. Anyway, I could go on. That's what Freedom Force International is all about, and we're already making some good strides, and this is not the place to talk about it. But if anybody is interested in that strategy, I invite them to come to our website and just check it out. I think you'll like it. The website is freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org.
Now, pretty much everyone living has been living underneath the Federal Reserve in their lifetime, so it's almost hard to imagine what a money system at this point would look like without the Fed. Can you describe what you see as a vision of what, if we accomplish ending the Fed, what our money system would look like?
Well, in exact form, no, because that should come about with public choice. We should have some options to choose from. I think that the ideal money system, in my own view, is a system that's backed by something tangible, something that takes human effort to produce. I don't care what it is. There are certain things I think are more ideally suited than others. I believe that gold and silver, for example, are ideal. And it's not just my opinion, but throughout history, every time a culture has been free to choose something for money, and it's just been a choice of the people and not forced on them by their rulers, it's always been gold or silver. I think there's a reason for that, because it's very democratic. Everybody has access to it. It takes human effort to produce. That's the main thing. I mean, you could base a money system, I suppose, on bottles of cheap white wine if you wanted to. Might not be bad. I mean, in prison, we know that cigarettes are money. In many countries following World War or during World War II, countries in Europe where everything was scarce and money was useless because there was no backing to any of the money. It was just paper money. Cigarettes and things like silk stockings and clothing, anything that's material that took human effort to produce and that was scarce, circulated as money. And so you can have many different kinds of money, but my preference, as I say, is that it should be backed by precious metals. But I'm not in a position, nor do I ever want to be, where I could force my decision on others. I think people should be free to choose. I think the basic problem with money is that governments decide they want a monopoly of the issuance of money. They want to make sure that you accept their money, no matter what they do to it, no matter how cheap they make it, no matter how much of it they produce. They want to send you to prison if you don't accept it. And so they have these things called legal tender laws, which means that only that money of that state can be accepted as legal. Well, if you take that out of the picture and let people choose what they wish, I know what they're going to choose. They're going to choose something eventually that is scarce and something which requires human effort to produce, because that's the only way you can be sure that some crook isn't manipulating the supply of the money and raking off the how's the word? I guess they're legally plundering the people by just keep issuing more and more money. So I think the answer, to answer your question in the short term, is just whatever people decide to use, they should be given the freedom of choice. Now, let's just say that they've chosen let's say they've chosen Federal Reserve notes that now are called Treasury certificates. The Federal Reserve is out of the picture. Let's say that's been abolished. And so the Treasury steps forward and say, okay, we're going to issue Treasury certificates, we'll call them, as they used to be called. And that certificate, the word implies that it is a certificate or a receipt proving that there is a stated amount of gold or silver in a warehouse at the government mint. And if you don't want this piece of paper and you really want that gold or silver, just present it to the warehouse or one of the regional branches, and we will give you your gold or silver. Now, most people are going to take the paper as long as they know that the gold and silver is in the warehouse, and they can get it anytime they wish. And that's the trick, you see. If you can't deliver the gold or silver, let's say you've got a million ounces of silver, and you've issued 100 million certificates for an ounce of silver, which is the game they play now. They know that most people are not going to take those certificates and ask for their silver, and that's how they can print 100 times more than there is. But if they thought that they had to deliver, well, of course, they'd hesitate to print up all those certificates, knowing that if they were caught cheating the public like that, they would be taken to the gallows, let's say, or something very, very serious. And there have been laws like that. And that when people debauch the public currency, in other words, if politicians steal from the people, the penalty is death. Well, I'm not really advocating that, but I am saying when you consider that the penalties for stealing from the public can be severe, then you're seriously cramping the style of these politicians and bankers who do this all day long. This is a normal business practice. So I don't know what the money would look like. I don't know what it would be called, but I do know that whatever it is in a system which had money based on something that required human effort to produce, under that system, the value of the currency would remain extremely stable over long periods of time. In other words, it would purchase the same amount 100 years from now as it does now, or maybe more. Instead of less, we know, it'll purchase just as much and probably more. When you think of gold, for example, 1,000 years ago, if a person had a gold coin, 1 ounce gold coin, what could you buy with it? Well, the records are pretty clear on that. You could buy a really fine toga. You could buy a handcrafted belt and a pair of sandals, good sandals that would really last, for 1 ounce of gold. Now, today, if you've got a 1 ounce gold coin and you cash it in for Federal Reserve notes, what can you buy with it? A really nice Italian suit. You can buy a really nice handcrafted belt and a really nice pair of shoes. 1,000 years later, the purchasing power of gold and or silver is pretty stable. And it does so because it takes human effort to produce that gold and silver, just as it takes human effort to produce the toga or the suit, the sandals and the shoes and the belts. It's human effort on both sides. So that's what I see a good money would look like. I don't know what you call it, what it would physical appearance would be, but I do know that people who had money and saved money wouldn't be cheated with the passage of time through inflation. They would be rewarded by saving, and they would then have money to invest. It would lead to the opening up of new industry. People would live at a much higher level of living, and I think there'd be a lot more tranquility in our society.
Well, you've just answered my next question I was going to ask, which is how would life without the Fed benefit the average American? I'm thinking about our aging population and how many retirees are trying to live on a fixed income, that sort of thing, and the value of their life savings being dwindled down through the effect of diluting of the money supply through overprinting of money. And
yeah, it's not being dwindled down, it's being stolen from them. Let's put it clearly.
Right.
Being stolen from these people by the manipulators of money.